Hello, everybody! Happy New Year! One and all, welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend Charles for the 200th time.
I know, I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan. Not just any fantasy today, because today is our 200 episode special. Woo! Can you believe it, man? 200 episodes. Wow, what a journey it has been. I was so excited to be here. Got so much fun stuff planned for today, as you could tell from the title. But, I mean, before we get into it, I think we really just got to quickly recap and be like, reflect on 200 episodes.
Yes, let's reflect. You see, we did a lot of episodes, and eventually we came to 200 of them, and now we're here commemorating it. Was that a good reflection,
That's
Charles?
a fantastic reflection. It's exactly what happened. Great recap. Yeah, we've got some exciting stuff planned. It's like, how do you acknowledge 200 episodes? You know, so much time has gone by, so many books we've discussed, and the question came up like, have we talked about enough books to do a 200 books in less than 200 minutes kind of discussion? And we put a list together.
Possibly in less than 2 hours.
Yes.
You'll know by the title of this episode how quickly, or also by the length of this episode, how quickly we were actually able to do it.
Right, 200
Charles.
reviews in under 2 hours, I would say. 200 minutes is way longer than that. So
Oh, no. If this goes, if this goes 3 hours, Charles, I mean, that's over 3 hours.
Right,
3
so
hours
we are
and 20
going
minutes.
to start the clock and do a lightning fast recap of 200 books, many of which we've talked about on the show, to kind of give you all a sense of just how many books we've talked about over the years and over the episodes, and to also celebrate all of these wonderful books in the wonderful world of science fiction and fantasy. And as you're listening, keep your ears open for some of these book recommendations. And
Don't close your ears.
listen very carefully. Who knows?
Yes.
Is there a 30-second review of a certain book that you do differently? Let us know. If there's ones that grab your interest, let us know, because we're going to be talking about a lot. So if you have a little notebook handy, or get that get that list ready to go. And I guess we may as well do some of our outro stuff at the top. It's because we've got a lot of books to talk about. So before we get into it, I feel like we should say, thank you all so much for listening over 200 episodes. And I think, I speak for both of us when I say that the best part of doing this, beyond getting to talk fantasy with my friend, is all of the people we've gotten to meet along the way, all the authors, all the fans, all the other content creators. It's been so much fun watching the show grow from what we used to call shouting into the void, releasing episodes where 3 people listened and we were 2 of them. I
never listened.
Then who was that other person?
I know it was you, your mom, and maybe the third person was actually someone that we didn't know. Who's to say?
That's true. So, we've come a long way since then, and we're looking forward to the rest of the year. It's only the beginning. We've got Friends Pitching Fantasy coming up. That's dusting off an old classic series, and we're going to be talking about books that we're going to read in the imminent future here. We've got Stormlight Archive in the works as well. So a lot of really exciting stuff coming up for the show this year, and I'm excited to get into it.
I'm excited to get into it too, Charles. And I'll just say that I second everything Charles is saying about how awesome it's been being able to make 200 episodes and interact with all of you fantastic people along the way, whether you're a person who creates content, whether you're a person who's just listening, whether you're an author, whoever's out there. We absolutely love you, and it's been such an honor.
An honor indeed. I love you all as well. if let's get those 5-star reviews coming in. Follow us on social media.
Wow.
And at the FTF podcast and on Instagram, and put that number 1 at the end, at the FTF podcast 1 on Twitter. And let's keep the conversation going.
To our podcast.
Spotify, Apple.
Is this the end of the episode?
Nope.
Yeah, you can rate us on Spotify. Yeah, it feels wrong. Feels wrong to ask them to do that. It feels
wrong, but I think it's important to get that in the front, because we're about to embark on our own epic journey here. So with that being said, I've got my pot of tea next to me here. I've got the book list up. What do you say, shall we do 200 reviews?
Yes, in less than 2 hours, hopefully. I don't know if we're going to do that.
I think we can try our best. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get this started. We're going to start with kind of the order of the books we read on the show. The first series we ever read, Mistborn. Dylan, let's go. Mistborn, what do you got?
All right, Mistborn, number 1, Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, number 1 gateway fantasy, if we're just trying to get folks into it. Incredible magic system, classic world building from Brandon Sanderson, probably the first one, The Final Empire, the strongest in my opinion. Well of Ascension keeps up the quality, and then Hero of Ages has one of the most fantastic conclusions to any series. No one wraps things up to a series like Brandon Sanderson with that Sanderlanche.
Yep, the Sanderlanche of all Sanderlanches, great twists and reveals and mysteries along the way. Gateway fantasy for sure. Kingkiller Chronicles. I mean, this was kind of like our big breakthrough conversation here. So much has happened when we discuss these books, and Dylan finally got me to read them, and it's one of the best books that I've read on the show for sure. Patrick Rothfuss is an incredible writer, and Dylan, I know you got a lot to say about this series as well, but I highly recommend it.
Yeah, maybe my favorite series of any period. The prose is my absolute favorite of anyone writing in the genre. Name of the Wind is possibly my favorite book in period again. Mm-hmm. And The Wise Man's Fear I also consider a 5-star read very clearly. It's just, I think, a very lyrical telling of a legendary story about a guy named Quoth. I love the romantic relationship in it, and it's awesome talking about it, and we have a bunch of episodes going into way more detail.
That's a must read.
And there's also Slower Guard of Silent Things. Sneak that novella in there. Talks about Ari, who is kind of a whimsical figure in
and Patrick Rothfuss reads the audiobook too,
yes.
So it's a little treat there you're not going to want to miss.
Yes.
So Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, Return of the King, The Hobbit, all those, that's, that counts as 4 books for anyone that's counting. That's 11 books now we're talking about here. And, not 11 books, 10 books. And, guys, this one classic series captured my imagination from a young age, has influenced so much writing since. And even when we revisited it for the show way back when as our 3rd series ever, I just really enjoyed it. And there were moments that were actually kind of exciting and scary. And then it's awesome to see just a book that was written so long ago, how much of what Tolkien created is still a critical part of what's inspiring authors today. And that's just a huge feat for any author. So obviously love Tolkien, love Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Granddaddy of
Granddaddy. Absolutely. Yeah. The first face on the Mount Rushmore of fantasy, no doubt about it. So moving on, Dylan, this is one that you kind of brought into the show for us. We had to stop our regularly scheduled reading session to read The Poppy War, book number 11 on our list here, and then The Dragon Republic and The Burning God as the Poppy War series. And what a great modern, fresh, to compare it to Tolkien is so funny. If Tolkien's deep classic, R.F. Kuang is the cutting edge modern, and it was really fast-paced, really exciting, and based on some tough parts of history between Japan and China and World War II, and it takes that brutality and it creates some endearing characters, but problematic as well.
Endearing?
Not endearing, but it's you like them even though they commit horrible war crimes, and it's like their story and you see their suffering, and it makes them empathetic in some ways, and it raises some interesting questions, I'd say.
I agree with you. It's fantastic work by R.F. Kuang. I think Poppy War, the first one, was my favorite of the three. Dragon Republic gets into even more military fantasy and really strong writing. And The Burning God, the conclusion is really, I think, shocking in a lot of ways. I think we called it, it's one of those inevitable feeling endings, but it still hits you hard.
And Rin is one of our favorite protagonists. Hard stop. One of the most proactive for sure. And the book just moves at a lightning fast pace, and that's all due to Rin's just determination and sheer force of will. And that is interesting to watch, even as she's succeeding or suffering or dealing with relationships or dealing with a continental war. So all of that is very fascinating. So that moves us to book number 14, Emperor's Soul. This was our first collab on the show with Fantology, shout out. And this is a great short story. I mean, if you've got a short drive, like a 4-hour drive or something, or if you're just trying to introduce your friend to the world of fantasy and you want something super low commitment, this little short story is a lot of fun. And asked the great question of like, what is a soul? What about a soul makes it that can you like recreate it? Can you define it? Can you build one? And how would you do that? And it's a very interesting story about art and artistic license. And it was really cool.
Totally agree. This is another good intro to Sanderson's work. It's a novella, and it's one that feels like it borders the most on capital L literature of any of Sanderson's work, I think. It deals with these really highbrow themes in a relatively short way for Sanderson, who loves those. We call them Chihuahua Killers, the giant, 1,000+ page novels. You got to keep them away from your pet because they're heavy.
Yes, exactly. And it's just a really fun story, and it is part of the Cosmere too, which is interesting. And highly recommend. That brings us to book number 15, The Last Wish, Andrei Sapkowski, the first book in the Witcher series. We have all the Witcher books here today. That'll take us to books 15 to 21 here. So we discussed The Last Wish and The Sword of Destiny on this show. And those, I really enjoy those books. They're so much fun. It's like a kind of like a short story anthology that also has an arc that goes across them all. And they're all focused on Geralt the Witcher, who we all know by now is fantastic video games. It's a Netflix series that even has spin-off shows now. So huge IP coming from Andrzej Sapkowski. And the fact that it's rooted in like Polish folk lore, but interpreted in a modern way. Geralt is this very kind of morally conflicted gray character who has his own identity issues. And those first two books, The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny, highly recommend. The rest of the series is an actual saga, right? An actual story. It's not short stories. They're novels, and they tell this long arc of The Witcher. And I think, honestly, The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny are Andrzej Sapkowski's best work. I always say that, and I always say start there. It's the intro to the series anyway, and then if you really like it and you really love the games and you want that added context, like the story is very good, but if you read those and you're like, that was okay, I honestly say it's the best work he has to offer, so you could stop there and be totally fine. And a lot of the TV show pulls from these two short story anthologies as well, so you wouldn't be missing too much going any further. So huge influential work, and I'm excited to see what the series is going to do in the future. I know it's grabbing headlines like crazy right now, so we'll see where it comes out, but huge fan of The Witcher.
Yeah, I did read the two short story anthologies, and then I stopped, so I'm satisfied with that decision.
In a world where there's so much to read, I think that's
right.
That's good. And that brings us
I didn't
to...
fall in love with it, but
Yeah.
great book.
And I think
short
it suffers
stories,
from the
but
translation from Polish to English as well. There's some weird stuff going on there. But, it's still a really creative series. That brings us to book number 22, Red Sister by Mark Lawrence. First book of the Book of the Ancestor. We've got all the books in the Book of the Ancestor series. Dylan, why don't you champion this one, since this was your recommendation back in the day?
Yeah, Red Sister. It's got killer nuns in it, basically, as do the rest of the books in this series. It's my favorite series, I would say, by friend of the show, Mark Lawrence, who also did Prince of Thorns and stuff like that. We'll get into those. It is action-packed. It's got a strong female protagonist in Nona, and it's got these really heartwarming themes as well, like things like friendship and the value of that, and Lawrence explores that in a really cool way. I think we even did like an episode called The Theme of Friendship in Red Sister or something like that we're lucky enough to have Mark listen to, and he was making jokes about. So he does a fantastic job. It's interesting seeing this balance of some of these more like grimdark feeling things with like kids who are have these awesome magic powers and are in these really dark situations, as well as the, I guess, like heartwarming stuff that you wouldn't expect from the author of Prince of Thorns, which we'll get into.
Some great
later.
characters.
Unreadbound short story
Oh,
in between Grey Sister
Don't
and
skip
Holy
on
Sister,
Bound.
and that one's Don't Skip Bound, and that one is a lot of fun. Actually, I would say it's not as action packed, though there's a little bit.
There's some interesting
yeah,
relationship
that's pretty
dynamics going on in Bound, and I'd say Nona is
Yeah.
a fantastic character. Even Avis Glass, for whatever reason, sticks with me in my brain to this day more than
She's
many
like
of the
the
characters.
mastermind working.
She's like the Dumbledore,
resident
but nothing
Tywin
like
Lannister.
Dumbledore. Yeah, Tywin Lannister, right?
It's
right,
like
right.
if Dumbledore had Tywin Lannister's brain, but a little bit more. I mean, we'll get
Compassionate
into
and
Avis
loving and everything,
Glass's.
but yeah, she's not like
Yeah,
evil, but
she's got that kind of scheming going.
for sure. And it's just a book that's
Great
not afraid
books.
to be fun. And Mark Lawrence is just that
Yeah.
way too. He just writes fun action pieces. So highly recommend.
Yeah.
And especially coming from Prince of Thorns, which is his first work, to Book of the Ancestor, which is some of his more contemporary stuff. It's like really fun to watch him kind of grow and progress and write new characters. So highly recommend. And that takes us to Monstrous. We're going to cover the first 3 volumes, and those count as 3 books. So 26, 27, 28 are Monstrous volumes 1 to 3. Yeah, Dylan, you, I think, brought this to the table, right? And,
Yep.
We got to talk about this with Our Pod on their show as well.
We did.
And there's a lot to discuss about these books. They're really fascinating. Marjorie Liu, who's the author, and then Sana Takeda, who's the illustrator. Very rarely have we done a graphic novel series on the show, and this was an interesting first attempt for us, and there's a lot of really good conversations to have in here. And what was interesting to me is that most of the characters, it's like an epic fantasy series, but it's a matriarchy, and it was very interesting and kind of eye-opening to me to read that, where even like supporting characters, side characters, soldiers, predominantly women, and it's done in a really interesting, thought-provoking way, at least to me. And the main character is also awesome. It very similar to kind of this Rin Nona kind of character vibe of powerful female warrior who's like trying to make sense of their relationships and their life, and in this world that's super dark and super gritty and super violent, almost completely hopeless, where she manages to find hope and power and reasons to keep going is very thought-provoking.
Right. I've always thought of this as being a very grimdark world with characters who are almost more epic, or even, I don't know if heroic is strong for all of them, but the themes that they work through the characters with it, a lot of it is about hope, like you mentioned, Charles, and trying to find a way to, I guess, not just survive, but to try to do the right thing and be moral in a way that you might not see with the more typical grimdark characters. So it's a really interesting mix of all sorts of stuff. There's like steampunk elements to it as well, and the illustrations are unbelievable and so detailed. And,
well, shout out to Sana Takeda,
those
who
big pictures,
super intricate detail in the illustrations, and the way she uses color. Mostly it's black and brown, and then in certain elements she uses bright color. Is very interesting, and it must have taken her forever to make these, because they're each page is so beautiful and so meticulously illustrated. Like, the amount of detail on each page is absolutely crazy, but that's what makes the series that much more it's the whole atmosphere of the series, and it's very successful in doing that. And it's, for a graphic novel, that's half the battle right there. So important, and Sana Takeda smashes it out of the park.
That she does. But speaking of smashing things out of the park, Charles, it looks like we're coming up on the first Law series here, beginning with the Blade itself. I'll get into these, and okay, I'm gonna try to do like each book individually.
I think that's fair.
The Blade, and this is maybe our favorite series.
Most influential on the show, biggest milestones. Got to interview Joe Abercrombie, which was a dream come true. Like, so much fantastic stuff with this series. I think we've got a big good section of people that listen to us that found us through Abercrombie and our shared love of Abercrombie. So let's take this a book at a time here. Why don't you kick us off with our 29th book today, The Blade itself.
All right, The Blade itself, I think it's where you do have to start for this entire First Law universe, but I would say it's actually the weakest of Abercrombie's work, as it's his first novel. I would still easily give it 5 stars because they're all 5-star reads for me, but the weakest 5. And the way that I describe it, it's got incredible characters, incredible dialogue, all these things that we've come to expect from Joe in the not that long time since he's written it, because he's still a fresh new voice in the genre, as he assured us in our interview. But The Blade itself, it does not really tell a complete story. And not that much really happens in the book. So I would always try to give that warning. I'm like, look, if you love these characters and you enjoy their dialogue, you think it's funny and interesting, it's like, okay, get through this one, but you gotta keep going, and more things will happen down the line.
And even like to say to keep Charles, going, like, I mean, it's captivating from the beginning. Like, when we meet Logan Ninefingers, when we meet Glokta, Abercrombie's voice and writing style immediately stick out, are immediately entertaining, and these characters come to life so fast. And some of the best character work in fantasy, hard stops. So yes, it's like weirdly a short story in terms of plotting, but there's so much to enjoy and love about this one, and there's all kinds of fun satirical stuff going on. It's a great debut, but like you said, Dylan, definitely you can't judge it by The Blade itself alone. You gotta go through the whole trilogy. There's just so much to love.
Yeah, because later on, Abercrombie, as we get into the later books here, he does develop a much stronger skill for telling a complete story in individual books, even within a trilogy. He does that extremely well in the later books that we'll discuss. Here, these first 3 are like, you need to get the complete story, you need to read all 3, or to get a complete story. So anyway, next up in those 3 is Before They're Hanged. This one, it's really interesting in how parody is too strong, but how it draws from things like The Lord of the Rings and this idea of a fellowship and a quest. subversion is the word I was looking for. Thank you, Charles. Like, it's a great subversion of a lot of these ideas of questing and all of that we get. We most think of the Lord of the Rings with that, and there's a few moments that even seem to draw directly from the Lord of the Rings and subvert them. And but in Abercrombie's deft hand and with his totally unique voice, it is just a romp at times, while also bringing those elements of grimdark. And I think when I think of Before They're Hanged, it's where I really start to see Abercrombie developing his ability to use point of view extremely well, like how different the point of views are, and in the writing style and in just the way that this character that you're in the view of at that moment would see the world and would see the other people around them. So I always think of a few moments that illustrate that so well from Before They're Hanged, and he only gets stronger with it from there. Incredible book.
Incredible. And yeah, like you said, this is a masterwork of POV, not only to tell the story and get us involved with the characters, but for humor as well. Agree completely. And this was coming out at a time where Game of Thrones was as big as it ever would be, huge. And then you have this wave of grimdark stuff and subverting stuff. I think of even like Mark Lawrence's Prince of Thorns, for example. Game of Thrones was really popular. This series was super popular as well. I think they all kind of fall into that when grimdark was at its peak, and Abercrombie nailed it completely, nailed that point in time in popular fantasy, and has only continued to evolve since then, for sure, while still like staying within the genre. But I mean, this was something that fantasy fans were kind of starved for. It's like, I know the Lord of the Rings story, I know the Harry Potter story, like what else you got for me? And Abercrombie delivered huge, and especially with Before They're Hanged is like the biggest, one of his boldest statements on that, for sure.
And if I'm remembering correctly, Charles, was this our buddy Will Gwynn's #1 ranked book?
It may have been
top First Law Universe books. Will Gwynn over at the Brothers Gwynn.
I mean, it's the wrong choice, but it's a worthy choice.
It's the wrong choice, but I mean, when they're all 5 stars, you can't go too wrong in how you assort them. But great book. Last Argument of Kings is coming up next, Charles. That's the conclusion of his original First Law trilogy. And here you get to see Joe Abercrombie's master plan come to fruition. And there's just nothing like it in the genre. I haven't seen anything like it that's come before. I haven't seen anything like it since. And I think this is, reading the final book, it's got an ending that is very different from what you might expect from your typical fantasy novels, but it's so just uniquely Abercrombian and for me, perfect. For you, good. Charles, it felt a little flat the first read, but you kind of came around on it, having read it multiple times.
I will say, I was not, expecting the ending that I received. It left me wanting more as well. I'll say that. Don't want to get too into it. Check out our Last Argument of Kings episode if you've read these books, so you can hear us get into it, because there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had. But yeah, it's Abercrombie has always done this. He makes new ground and makes these bold, sometimes polarizing choices in his writing. That's all I'll say. And it works so well in the world, and it works so well for the characters that you may not realize what kind of book you're reading, and Abercrombie, when he changes that perspective on you, it's a magical thing that very few authors can do. So it's really an interesting progression, and it only opens up the world to another set of standalone stories that kind of continue along the path of the First Law universe, the first one being our 32nd book today, Best Served Cold. This is very like Tarantino vibes, like Kill Bill vibes to me. It's a revenge story. It's very action driven. It's someone going around and getting revenge on a lot of people and killing them in spectacularly bloody ways. But you get some really interesting thematic developments here. You get to watch character arcs that are not your typical character arcs, I'll say that, but they're just as captivating. I won't get more into that, but Dylan, I think you know what you're picking up what I'm putting down here.
Yes. Yeah, the character work as strong as ever. Best Served Cold shows Abercrombie's ability to write a full story that it is a standalone that comes to a satisfying conclusion over the course of one book.
It is contained
and
story.
Abercrombie, I think it's underrated how almost meditative he can be on these themes that he explores, because I think he just can't come at a story in a straightforward way. Just his personality is going to come at it a little sideways, a little snarky, a little clever, very clever, I'll say. And this is a revenge story, so Abercrombie's gonna think about the revenge story and try to, I don't know if he does it, I don't think he does this consciously, but he's going to end up subverting it a little bit just by nature of who
Nicomo Casca fans rejoice. This is some of his best moments. I love at the end, he's got a line where it's like, I don't even want to say it because it spoils, it might spoil things, but it's so funny and it's so good and I love it. And it's just Abercrombie, in my eyes, is like incredible. So great story, and that leads us into the heroes, which of the standalones might be my personal favorite. I will let you take the next one, which is your personal favorite. But sure. I mean, the heroes, it takes place over 3 days. It's much more confined and much more stripped down in terms of scope and plot than Abercrombie's other works. But that just only lets his character work kind of thrive. You get some new perspectives here. You get Gorst, right? You get so many other fantastic characters who I won't get into too much. I don't want to spoil anything by saying names of people or anything, but I will say that this is Abercrombie's. When we talk about his POV work, there are some breakthrough moments in his development as an author kick off in this book. I mean, he's got a big battle scene with like 1 million point of views, and it's so beautifully written. And you see how it influences all his later work. You see him really, like, I feel like even from the beginning, he was experimenting with the genre and his voice as an author. But we've talked about the first book being, of all his 5 stars, maybe on the lower end. And that's only because he's just learned and improved with every book. And I think the heroes, you see a lot of critical moments in Abercrombie's writing pay off here. And then he just grabs onto these ideas and develops them even more in the Age of Madness we'll get into. But I just love this one. So much humor, so much fun. I want to say so many more characters, but I don't want to talk about them for people that haven't read the original books yet. We're going to keep the spoiler free, but so many fun POVs in this one that it's my personal favorite. I think it's a lot of people's favorites, although lots of love for Best Served Cold too, which I get. But the heroes, to me, just had some of these standalones had some of his best work from a writing perspective, and we see a lot of it come into full development in the Age of Madness, starting with the heroes. So big fan.
Well said, Charles, and we'll leave it at that and get into Red Country, which is my personal favorite of the standalones. Abercrombie, with these standalones, he did basically try to take a fantasy spin to 3 different kinds of stories that are almost different genres. Like Best Served Cold is kind of thriller revenge story. Heroes does military fantasy, and what Red Country brings is a Western. And it is... such great character work. It's Abercrombie showing that he isn't just stuck in this military grimdark fantasy stuff. I think that a lot of the growth as an author shows in how he's willing to
let go.
I don't want to say certain things because of spoilers too. And it's just, I think, Abercrombie having a lot of fun. You can tell his love for Westerns in this one. And I just really appreciate it. I think the best character work in the 3 standalones, and I that's one where I really can't get into certain characters
No,
because of
yeah,
spoilers.
yeah.
So I'm
This
really
is your
dancing
best. It
around
is
it.
one of the. It is the most underrated of the standalones for the reasons you described. I think there's so much of this. The fact that Abercrombie's willing to let go and move on with his world and his characters. It's like if you write like a hit series like Harry Potter, you don't want to like, age out Harry Potter and write the next person. It's like, no, it's Harry Potter, but like Abercrombie's willing to move on and to progress his world from like
all these standalones move like a decade or so into the future,
right? So to move his world from like
cover totally different characters
medievalish
from the original.
Euro fantasy world to now Western world and to Age of Madness, which is like Industrial Revolution world. It's like you have such a hugely popular series. It would be so easy to just write more of what people already have read and liked. But Abercrombie cannot be content to sit idly in his world, and he's always pushing and exploring his characters and his themes. And fantastic example of that in Red Country. I wish we could say more, but we said a whole lot more in our Red Country episode, so definitely check that out. But Dylan, we can't sleep on Sharp Ends, the short story collection and the world of the first law.
That sounds painful.
Exactly right. But the book number 35 today, Sharp Ends, it kind of bridges the gap between the First Law universe and the Age of Madness, which is still First Law, but set way in the future, like a couple generations ahead. So this story does a great job of giving us more character work. It picks different points of times, some way before even the Blade itself, and gives us some background on characters, and it kind of recontextualizes for those that maybe read the original trilogy and didn't realize what kind of book they were reading. They kind of get that delivered a little bit more. It's like, hey, these are the kind of things that we're working on here, and this is kind of the subversion that we're talking about, and just Abercrombie having some unrelenting fun in this one. For your audiobook fans, even Abercrombie makes a cameo to do a little bit of audiobook narration for this. So great. And we haven't shouted out Stephen Pacey. I don't know how we haven't done that, but one of the best audiobook narrators the game. All of these books, he narrates them all. He's incredible. Of all these books, of all the audiobooks I've listened to in this whole list of 200, Stephen Pacey, First Law, number 1, no contest. No contest. And that's in a genre with fantastic audiobooks.
Totally. Sharp Ends, that's the one people sometimes miss, but it does have stories that add to the overall First Law universe for sure, and we get some point of views we wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And next up, we've got A Little Hatred. That's the first of Abercrombie's The Age of Madness. That's taking a totally new trilogy later on in the chronology of the world. And I think The Age of Madness, it's an even stronger series than the original First Law. The characters from the original First Law, there's a couple, especially like Logan and Glokta, that are still my top couple characters.
Right.
And they're just such like classic characters at this point in the genre. They're the OGs. But the plotting and of course the characters are still extremely strong in these 3 books, but the plotting is so much faster paced. I mean that in all the best ways possible. And A Little Hatred, he throws you right into it with this one and shows how much better a job he can do of both providing that character work and telling that complete story while still leaving what he needs to leave on the table to tell a complete awesome trilogy. So A Little Hatred, another step forward in Abercrombie's evolution.
Well said. I think all the maybe criticisms, I'm using air quotes, that we had for the original trilogy, like Blade itself, particularly from a narrative plotting standpoint, totally like, we're what, like 6-7 books later in Abercrombie's like experience as an author, and like you said, Dylan, he's just smashed it out of the park. And in my opinion, our 37th book that we're talking about today, The Trouble with Peace, is like the second in the Age of Madness, is perhaps his best work, and it is a masterpiece of fantasy writing, absolute masterpiece, both from the actual story to the writing abilities of Abercrombie. Every scene is just, it's engaging, it's entertaining, it's fun, and it moves the plot forward, and it delivers those narrative plot points, and it keeps going. And for a second book in a series, it feels like the third, and there's a lot of reasons why, which we'll get into the 39th book, or the 38th book we're talking about today, the Wisdom of Crowds. But man, Trouble with Peace, and traditionally you get that second book slump in a trilogy, and I think Abercrombie was aware of this and totally flipped it on its head. And masterful work of fantasy literature here with Trouble with Peace. Everything we talked about, like the lessons that we gleaned from the heroes in Red Country, and like all of these things he's experimenting with POV and plot development, he has finally, at the end of his Age of Madness trilogy, smashed it out of the park. But there's still one more book to go, and when you've already kind of perfected that traditional arc and you perfected your plotting and your storytelling, where do you take it? And the answer is Wisdom of Crowds, which I don't want to get too into, but for a third book in a trilogy, it turns everything on its head. I will say this, Abercrombie, in our interview with him, was talking about how he studied psychology, a student of psychology, and had a thesis on human failure. And it's like, what happens when humanity is faced with just catastrophic failure? And take that for what you will when you go into Wisdom of Crowds, because it's unlike any third book in a fantasy series I've ever seen. Stuff, I almost cursed, gets out of control in this book, and it's so fascinating to watch everything just kind of...
Stuff hits the fan.
Exactly right. Fantastic.
Yeah. In an exploration of human failure, Abercrombie's conclusion to the Age of Madness is anything but, and it's a triumph.
Did you just write that?
Right, that's good, right?
That's a blurb right there.
Fantastic.
They should print that on the book. Write that down.
I know.
Good thing we have this recording.
Right?
Send that to Abercrombie.
As if Joe wants me on the cover when he can probably get George R. R. Martin again. But anyway, let's move forward.
That's Abercrombie. We got to move a lot faster now.
By the way, Abercrombie was probably like 15 minutes of
But we had to take the time. Now we just got to move up. We'll keep things moving here. Book number 39, Daughter of Flood and Fury by Levi Jacobs. This, Levi Jacobs was an author, our first author interview ever. Spiffbo finalist Levi Jacobs, of course. Love Levi, and this was the book that got him to the finals of Spiffbo, Daughter of Flood and Fury. A lot of Mistborn fans, I think, would...
Was it?
I
think it was actually his book before that had him in the... Yeah, okay. I think that's what had him in the...
I misspoke, but this one is certainly worthy of being a Spiffbo finalist for sure. It's a first-person narration, like young female protagonist, very proactive and like very action-driven.
And present tense.
Present tense as well, yeah. So it really kind of broke the... it really stood out in our reading catalog for that alone. And he succeeds. Not an easy way to go about writing a book, but because it's so action driven and the character's very like proactive, all of those I'm doing this, I'm doing that moments are like, it complements it very well. So love Levi.
Yeah, fantastic magic system, great recommendation for fans of Brandon Sanderson. And Levi Jacobs did beat Brandon Sanderson in a game of Magic the Gathering at one point. So
yep.
if you want to see what someone can do with even greater talent for Magic the Gathering when it comes to applying that to their writing, then Daughter, Flood and Fury by Levi Jacobs. Awesome book, fantastic guy. And
first, the Tidecaller Chronicles. I think the second one's out too, so you can check that out.
The third might be out. We got to catch up.
You got to catch up.
We also have to.
Speaking of catching up, I think we'll make up some ground here.
Yeah,
because we've got The Wheel of Time, books number 40 to 53 that we're talking about right now. Starting with The Eye of the World. We've read a good chunk of these on the show. Kind of took a break, and we'll get back to it at some point. But I have read them all, and I'll just kind of cap the whole thing. This is an interesting this, when you look at fantasy as a history, Wheel of Time is a very critical pivoting point that gets us from Tolkien clones to modern fantasy. And I think you see that with Eye of the World. So easy to identify the parallels between Tolkien and Eye of the World. So many similarities with characters and plot developments. You know, like Shire, Gollum, Dark One, Ringwraiths, like it's all in that book. But then it just kind of blossoms into its own thing. Very early and interesting exploration of a matriarchal power system, and like gender plays a role in magic, which is a very interesting idea to have, especially back in the 90s, of course. And although a lot of people can look back on it now and be like, oh, this not as progressive as we would hope, it's still, we wouldn't be as progressive in fantasy today without the success of something like this, I truly believe. And this did such a great job of bringing some new ideas and elements into fantasy. Hugely creative. It is very, very long, as we said. There's a ton of books in this series, so you have to be ready for the long haul. It's, 14 books, but and some of them are just a whole book where hardly anything happens, and that's just part of the journey you got to go on, because it does ended by Brandon Sanderson, by the way. Robert Jordan tragically passing away, leaving Brandon Sanderson to finish. And this was kind of Brandon Sanderson's breakout opportunity too, being able to write the last 3 books in this story based on Robert Jordan's notes. And he smashed it out of the park. And just in terms of epicness, I haven't read a series that felt as epic as this one, if only through the sheer volume of things going on in the world and the characters and everything like that. It balances that fine line where I'd say maybe Malazan is like, you need your notes next to you. With Wheel of Time, you can go along for the ride, and you can see how it influenced people like Sanderson to write something like the Stormlight Archive today. So, huge fan of the series, worth checking out for sure. The beginning and the end are strong. The middle can kind of sag a little bit, but it never stops being fun and creative, and fans of epic fantasy will feel right at home with the Wheel of Time. And now we've got the big show on Amazon, in with the works. It's I think it's okay, but it's brought it back into the limelight, and who knows, maybe season 2 will smash it out of the park. You never know. But yeah, it's one to watch.
That will not be a blurb for anything.
No, it won't.
Okay, but maybe season 2 will smash it out of the park.
But I think a lot of people would agree with me.
Well, you smashed that review out of the park, Charles. Sorry for anyone who wanted an individual breakdown of each book with the Path of Daggers,
They're all kind of combined to one story in my brain at this point. I read them back to back.
Oh, yeah. Unless you're a huge... Yeah, I'm just ripping you. Unless you're a huge read it over again Wheel of Time fan, how can you be like, oh, yeah, book 9, whichever one that is, 1, 2, 3... like The Winter's Heart. It's like, how do you remember all that? And you read them all back to back to back. It's not like you're reading them as they came out. So I can't even with trilogies sometimes remember like which book is
and we've talked about its influences on Game of Thrones and Brandon Sanderson. Like they all started here. Like those kind of characters were all kind of created and kind of the beginning seeds of it were planted here. So if you're a fan of the historical progression of fantasy, you can't miss this one. You cannot miss it.
So we need to do some historical progression in this episode.
We sure do. What's the next book?
The
book
Paper
number 54.
Menagerie.
Nice.
Yeah. Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. We can even do the Paper Menagerie in other stories because I've read that entire collection of short stories. Ken Liu, he's the master of the short story. This was the first... Charles, look this up while I'm talking because it was the first story to win, like, it's Hugo, Nebula, and I can't remember, it's like World Fantasy, but it's a first of like any format of book, or I don't know if book's the right word. The Paper Menagerie is the first of any kind of story to win all 3 of those awards, I believe.
It won the Hugo Award for Best Short Story and the Nebula for Best Short Story.
Oh, is it just the first to win both of those? That's interesting. Point being, total masterpiece. It feels like that capital L literature. Ken Liu
it swept the Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Awards.
Yeah, okay, that's what I was looking for, and the first to do that. So the Paper Menagerie, it explores in the short story right there. It explores these just huge themes of acculturation. It explores racism. It explors just
the mother-son relationship.
Highbrow stuff. Mother-son relationship, all in the course of about 20 pages, that short story. And if it doesn't make you cry, you are just dead inside. No offense, Charles. So
it was one of the most emotional things
my number
we've
one but did not make Charles cry because he's never cried from any sort of written word. But he, except his last credit card bill, am I right? But he...
Now the holidays are over, you're very right.
That's true. Ken Liu absolutely kills it, and the entire book, the short story collection, The Paper Menagerie, and other stories, all the rest of those are incredible as well. The way that he blends like sci-fi and fantasy and can kind of bridge those gaps. It's really amazing. And that being said, Paper Menagerie, that short story, is my favorite among all of them, and you can find that for free. You just got to Google to find the Paper Menagerie story online.
The audiobook is free too, right?
Totally legal. Well, not audiobook, but there is this... It's LeVar Burton, I believe, reading it. It's like LeVar Burton's podcast, like LeVar Burton Reads or something, and it's just him reading that to you. So I've read it in both of those formats. I highly recommend it either. It's made me cry either way.
Yeah, it's a great story.
Yeah,
we should read more of Ken Liu's work on the show, but we'll keep going for now. Book number 55, Cold from the North, another indie published book by D.W. Ross, book one of the Onyx-Born Chronicles. This is one of those, only one of two authors that we've read kind of this Norse-inspired mythology, and for fans for looking for some indie books coming out, D.W. Ross for sure is one to check out, I'd say, especially for all of you God of War fans and Norse mythology fans. It's like don't sleep on D.W. Ross.
Yeah. The thing that always sticks out to me with this book is the world building. I remember I was reading it in Florida, and just the way that he describes the world around him, I'm like, I'm feeling cold when I'm sitting outside.
All those chilly mountains, expeditions and things.
Yes,
yeah.
Right. So it does really transport you there to that Norse world. So fans of that definitely can find a lot to love from Cold from the North.
Speaking of a lot to love.
There's a lot to love in one of our favorite books that we've read on here, A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. Also put her mug on the Mount Rushmore of fantasy authors. Yeah. So that's the Earthsea cycle, the first one. And I don't even know where to start, how to get this in a short form review, but just so much wisdom and insight provided in this. One of the first, basically, YA works period, and like help create YA as even a concept. But Ursula K. Le Guin, she doesn't treat the reader like they're a child or they're young. She treats them with respect, and it has so much just wisdom to gleam, incredible prose, and avoids trying to fall into this like epic battle way of fantasy. It's so good. Just read it.
It's so much more reflective and meditative, and it almost reads kind of like a fable, but it's not. And
Campfire
we have a whole episode where we just read a whole we did a whole podcast where we just shared quotes with each other and talked about it, and we could have easily done a whole nother episode about it too, of just getting analyzing some of her writing and just celebrating it. And every time I read those quotes, I'm so impressed. And we had a whole I think our conversations around it are longer than the audiobook probably is. So, huge fans. Wizard of Earthsea. There's so many more in the Earthsea cycle too that we haven't read, but Ursula K. Le Guin, wow, like huge trailblazer in the genre and as just an author too, and some of the best work we've read on the show. It's so well written, and she's a fantastic author.
She is. And another fantastic author is Martha Wells, who does the Murderbot Diaries. All Systems Red is one that we covered on this show with, I believe, fiction fans.
Yep.
And this is just a really charming novella. It's very funny. Martha Wells has such a great voice in providing Murderbot as a character. It's sort of space opera-y. I wouldn't go so far as to call it sci-fi necessarily. It feels kind of more space opera. But yeah, it's, if you're looking for something to break a reading slump, something fresh and funny, this one will totally.
Well said. I see this one on our books and our fantasy pop up every once in a while. It's always like, how come no one told me this was so good? This book's excellent. And I see that post kind of like or bubble up every couple months. So it's definitely one that people read and gravitate to. This is another Hugo winner, right? This was another awards winner. Am I speaking out of turn?
I think it probably did, because it would be for novella.
Yeah,
but
right.
Let's keep rolling, Charles. We're at like an hour mark, and we're at like 58, so we'll see how we can do here.
Well, we've been talking about the books for 50 minutes, so okay, we'll move out. Okay, John Gwynne, another Norse-inspired author, big fan of the show, friend of the show, I'd say. We've had the privilege of collaborating with the brothers Gwynne multiple times. Just a really great family of fantasy content creators, and these books involve Norse mythology influence, and big return to form for monsters, and a great family dynamic, which you don't see in fantasy that often. It's usually like the coming of age kid, his whole family died, and now he has to go along alone. It's like, no, this is a nuclear family here, is how we kick this off, and very fun to watch that, and very fresh take on like a modern fantasy, like what's popular today, what are the trends that we're seeing, and I think Gwyn is ahead of that in terms of like characterization and storytelling and bringing monsters in and having some fun, as well as ripping your heart out. He does both. I think he's famous for that across his other series,
especially in The Hunger of Gods, the second one. There's he is very willing to rip your heart out, and I think Gwyn, the number one thing that I like to get across is his ability to write battles and fight scenes. They feel so realistic. You can tell that he does reenactment, and they're really cinematic. So it's awesome when those monsters get involved in fights. But Charles, there's another master of reenactment coming up next on this list, and that is Christian, actually written as Miles Cameron, his pen name. He's a friend of the show. We've had him on a few times, and one of those times was to discuss this book, Artifact Space, which we absolutely loved. It's like, it's such an interesting book. It's got incredible reviews. If you check Goodreads, it was so well received, and I believe we're finally getting the sequel relatively soon. But Artifact Space is it's a blend of this like slice of life on this giant like ship, and just people going about how they do their day to day, and then also these space opera elements with some of the larger battle stuff going on, and it's really interesting blend. I just can't think of any other book like it. And Christian Cameron, who writes this under Miles Cameron as a name, he is it's so talented at writing fights and battles too, because he's like a master of that reenactment and understanding medieval history and all that kind of. Well, I mean, they're swords, which is why I say medieval history, because they do fight with swords at times in Artifact Space. So great one to check out, and I'm
looking forward to the next book for sure. That brings us to
Yeah.
also a friend of the show. We've had him on a bunch of times. So much fun. He's such a funny, knowledgeable guy.
Oh yeah, Christian.
When
knows
he's
so much about
talking,
everything.
you want to be listening. So he's so much fun. And speaking of authors we've had on the show, Nicholas Eames, another one. We read Kings of the Wild not that long ago from the Banned series. Bloody Rose is book 2, which we're not going to count on this list because we haven't read it, but we'll do Kings of the Wild. And this one is just so much fun. You see it on Reddit all the time and other book recommendations because it's so easy to recommend. It's like, hey, what if mercenaries were like rock stars and they formed bands and that was part of their notoriety and they had that like a rock band dynamic amongst the group. And this is taking those maybe more retired band members and getting the band back together to go on another quest, and it's full of rock and roll references, it's full of humor, it's full of action, and Nicholas Eames is such a talented, generous voice in the genre, and we had so much fun talking to him, and if any of what I said sounds even remotely interesting, check it out. So many authors now that we've talked to coming up on this list. Books number 62 to 65, we've got Robert V.S. Reddick, The Chatham Voyage. This was a really fun read-along that we did with Blaze from Under the Radar Books and with Robert V.S. Reddick himself. This series, like, Robert has proven to be an incredible writer, like both with his prose and with the creativity of his plotting and just the things that he comes up with in this series. I was like, how does a human being even think these things up? It's insane that he was even able to create this situation and these worlds and the implications involved in these things. Like, it is wild at every single turn. And Dylan, I know you have a lot to say about the series. I'll hand it over to you to bring us home.
Yeah, this series helped create my love for fantasy as a genre, and I always think of it as what bridged the gap for me between, like, I'm a fan of Game of Thrones, like A Song of Ice and Fire, to like, oh, I just really like fantasy overall, don't I? Because Robert V.S. Reddick instilled that love for me with his awesome characters, with that incredible world building and plotting that was so unique. And I think, well, I gotta say, if we're trying to do the books a little bit individually, I want to say Red Wolf Conspiracy, great start, in The Ruling Sea and The River of Shadows, keep that going. But then the last one, The Night of the Swarm, has one of the most interesting, satisfying, and I think courageous conclusions to a series. And after Robert V.S. Reddick pulled together this whole thing with that conclusion, I just gained so much respect for him as a writer, even more so than from reading the previous installments. But
absolutely, you've never read an ending like this, for sure. And it's really, I always say poignant, but it is really just a thought-provoking,
hit you in the feels kind of ending. And we've seen it actually replicated in modern fiction, guys, like big budget blockbuster movies. You're like, oh my God, what? There's one that
You'll have to read
we
our
talked about. We won't say
book,
which movie, but there is a movie. Should we just say, we could say Marvel, because that narrows it down to
you could say
like
$1 billion Marvel movie
ever.
Which narrows it down to it still doesn't narrow it down too much.
There's still a lot of choices. One of them uses like the same plot
Marvel
elements
movie,
way later.
$1 billion one,
a big one, right.
So
either way,
either way,
one book that I hope we get $1 billion movie to present would be The Final Strife.
Oh yeah, with Sarah El-Arifi. This one is so
with
good.
How
Sunday Times bestseller.
Yeah, this is Sunday Times bestseller. We had Sarah on right before she became a Sunday Times bestseller. I'm not saying that we had anything to do with that, but it's an interesting coincidence.
Situation of events, how they rolled out. She came on our show. She then became a bestseller.
Correlation does not mean causation.
but it also
But-
doesn't not mean it.
It doesn't not mean it. So it doesn't mean it's not there. No, but we know that Sarah got the Sunday Times bestseller on the back of her incredible talent, not on her appearance of FDF necessarily, but The Final Strife is just an incredible, unique story that draws from more of these like African influences that
And
you don't
Arabic
see
as well,
much in
right?
fantasy, Arabic.
That's the interesting kind
So
of blend.
it's extremely we always talk about how when we were reading this one, we got the ARCs, the advanced review copy for these books, and we were just reading it on Kindle. We couldn't see actually the page count because it was just like a PDF copy for it,
Right.
and we ended up looking up afterward. How many pages is it, Charles?
It's like 600.
It's like over 600. And I looked that up and I saw it. I was just shocked. And I said to Charles, I was like, hey, like, did you know this book was over 600 pages? And we were both like, wow, it felt like 400 because the pacing is just so fast. And I mean, then all the most positive ways, it just draws you in. And before you know it, you read the whole story. It's got some of these almost like, I don't know if Hunger Games is the right way to put it, but you know, these kind of...
I see where you're going with Hunger Games, where it's like there's
with like a series of events and like a trials
challenges and
type thing. Yeah.
And it's such
Awesome
an interesting new perspective that I feel like we're getting in the fantasy genre at this, high of notoriety. And, it starts the book with just these drums and like spoken word kind of way to kick off the story, and it's grips you from the beginning. There's lots of LGBT inclusion as well, and a very interesting love triangle, and our main characters dealing with like substance abuse issues, which is very interesting. The magic system is very interesting, and I know for the sake of time, we got to keep going on, but don't miss this one. And the battle drum, the title was revealed just a few months ago, so we're looking forward to that highly anticipated release. Don't miss it. And speaking of highly anticipated releases, we've got Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive, book number 67 on our list today, The Way of Kings. And then we'll also include Words of Radiance, Edge Dancer, and Oathbringer, which we're actively reading right now. So those are the books. We won't include the last one, Rhythm of War, because we haven't talked about it on the show yet. But I will say that, if this is like the new Wheel of Time, the Wheel of Time for the modern age, I would say, because as much as we look back on Wheel of Time and there's things that we can critique with a lens of looking at it from 2023, all of that is kind of redone in Stormlight Archive, and you get Sanderson's magnum opus. You feel like, he's written so many bestsellers, and he's one of the voices in the genre, if not the voice, certainly one of the leading ones. Even right now, he's making huge moves in the industry, and not even just in how he writes, but how he conducts his business, which we all respect. And I think all of that, all of his work, he looks at the way he talks about the Stormlight Archive is that this is my magnum opus, my grand symphony. Like, this is where I'm putting all of my like inspiration into, and you feel that with these books, I'd say, for sure. To keep it quick.
Yeah, sure. I'll just talk about like 4,000 pages of book in like 10 seconds. It's epic, sprawling, and just Sanderson at his best, but wouldn't recommend it as like a first read for Sanderson. If you are trying to get into him, I'd sooner recommend like Mistborn is number one. Emperor's Soul would be another great one. But
we did a whole book about where to start with Brandon Sanderson.
Sure, we did. We did a whole episode on it. So anyway, I think the quality's pretty similar. I think in the three, Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, Oathbringer, Edge Dancer is kind of novella you sneak in there in between book 2 and 3. And we did an episode also on like if that is a must read. So
Keeping it moving.
Talking about must-reads.
Piranesi by Susanna
One
Clarke.
of them for me is definitely Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This one, we can't say too much about this one just because, like, it's one of those books where almost anything you say about it is a spoiler. But you start with this character who's kind of trying to like chronicle and do research on this house that he's in, which is kind of like a labyrinth with some like mystical stuff playing out in it. He's seems to be alone except for one other person who he comes into contact with, and it is just a phenomenal story, so well written, and it covers some highbrow themes, and it's one of my favorite releases of the last
it reminds me
5 years or
of The
so.
Martian by Andy Weir, where it's written in like journal entries, but unlike The Martian, which is like a NASA scientist writing journal entries and he knows what's going on, like you're given these journal entries from a guy who's very like innocent and naive, and although very scientific and analytical, but what's interesting,
not unintelligent,
right? Not unintelligent,
but, innocent.
What happens is you're reading a book where you have no idea what's happening or what's going on and what's true and what's not true, and like you're only given facts from a very I'm not biased, but very specific point of view, and they don't know what's going on fully.
It's like
either.
an unreliable narrator, but not for the typical reasons where you typically
not being
think
deceitful.
of unreliable narrators like they're deceitful. It's like it's not deceitful; he just doesn't exactly get what's going on, and he's trying to figure it out himself. So it's
you're reading most of this book, being like,
unfold.
"What is this book about? What am I reading?" But it's keeps you going.
But it's such a great. The prose is fantastic and all that. So
speaking of fantastic prose, Dylan, you want to take us to our next book?
Sure, and that's Among Thieves by friend of the show, MJ Kuhn. We had her on, and the sequel's coming out this summer, which is Thick as Thieves. But Among Thieves, it's just a really great book for fans of like heists. MJ describes it as Ocean's 11 meets Game of Thrones. It's very quick paced. I gave it a 5-star review on Before We Go blog, where you can see me writing a lot more about it, but it's really funny. It had me like cracking up at cafes and then realizing that's kind of weird and like being slightly embarrassed. So great dialogue, fun characters. It's just a really great book. Another one that I recommend to like break a reading slump or something like that. But it's inspired by the next series on our list, Charles.
Keep it going.
And this one's one you've grown to be associated with in your own way. The first one is The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch in the Gentleman Bastard sequence. And this is kind of the premier book that gets recommended if you want like a roguish, like heist, thieving crew type book in fantasy. And it's become a modern classic. Incredibly funny. The dialogue is just not like anything else you'll read in the genre, and like the character work is so good. Charles, what was your experience reading this book for the first time after tons of people trying to get you to do that for years?
This is another one of those books that's kind of those flagship at the age of grimdark and subversion and things. I feel like Gentleman Bastard sequence was always in the top 10 at that time for fantasy, and rightfully so. Some of the best cursing I've ever read in a book, hard stop. It's just magical. And some of the best character work I've ever seen. Locke Lamora has this interesting balance and dichotomy of him where he's like in this thieving crew, but he's also got this family balance and friendship balance, and you see a lot of compassion amongst people that will kill children, something like, all of these kinds of things. It's like in these moments of being practical and grimdark, there's also these moments of being compassionate and loving, and it's weird that a book can do both. But Scott Lynch does both very successfully.
Get you a book that can do both.
Exactly.
So we should do Red Seas Under Red Skies as the next one, and following that is The Republic of Thieves in the Gentleman Bastard sequence. And I've read these two. I would say The Lies of Locke Lamora is clearly the strongest of the three. The Red Seas Under Red Skies goes kind of more pirate on the whole thing. So if you're into that nautical fantasy, you are going to love it. It's still a great book. And then The Republic of Thieves is next up. And that's an interesting one, too. I do think, like, the weakest of the three, but you get some more backstory on some really important stuff that I can't get into because it's a third book in a series. But all definitely worth reading, with The Lies of Locke Lamora as the number one there.
We are at 1 hour and 10 minutes talking about books, not including our intro there. So we're not quite halfway. So let's power through some of these. Dylan, you were the only one that read book number 76 on our list, so why don't you take it?
The Priory of the Orange Tree. That was a tough one for me. It was not my favorite read, and it's extremely popular. And I see that this by Samantha Shannon. It's this like epic 800 plus page doorstopper of a book, and you just got to see this thing, giant pages and all that. Fantastic cover, but
beautiful.
I did find it. Yeah, I did find it a little bit. Plotting, right? That's a word for, like, it's a little bit slow moving for me. And yeah, it was a little bit tough, honestly. We flesh this out more with no spoilers in a Priory of the Orange Tree review episode with Hannah from Our Pod. So that's all I'll say. There's a lot of good moments. And love the feminist themes and LGBTQ representation, but just not the strongest for my taste.
Well said. Moving on,
one
back
that
to
it
friend of
was
the show,
great for
Mark
my
Lawrence.
taste.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Broken Empire
Prince
trilogy.
of Thorns.
Yep. King of Thorns, Emperor of Thorns, and do not even think about sleeping on Road Brothers, which we're counting on this list as well.
Don't you dare.
Book number 80. Don't you dare. So 4 books here. Wow. I mean, Prince of Thorns was definitely a trailblazer for the grimdark genre, I feel. This one, shocking from the beginning. And Jorg is one of my favorite characters and one of my least likable as well. When you talk about, like, proactivity and ends justify the means, no one lives up to that more than Jorg. And that's what was fun about reading this. Really interesting setting that I won't get too into. But I will say that there is, a couple different elements that are not usually commonly found in fantasy, found in these books, and that just makes his world building. Mark Lawrence has a really fascinating way to create worlds. I think he uses a lot of his knowledge as a scientist to develop his worlds, and Broken Empire trilogy is no exception. And then it just continues with King of Thorns and Emperor of Thorns. Just a fantastic series overall. Tons of action. If you like blood and guts,
shout
and
out to It's really dark, so I don't recommend it to everyone. I think something like Red Sister is one you can recommend. That
more palatable if you have like like things around extra violence or sexual assault or things like that. Like,
sure,
like the Broken Empire trilogy is way edgier. I'll say, super edgy.
Yes, and yeah. Shout out to King of Thorns in particular for having one of my favorite endings in any fantasy book. But
that's
we won't
a great
get into
one.
what that ending is. And don't you skip Road Brothers.
Don't even think about it.
But we're gonna skip over talking about that in detail because we got to get to the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin, the first in the Broken Earth series, and we'll just do the whole Broken Earth series.
Swept the Hugos, fellow Tulane grad.
Season. Yeah. So yes, and fellow psych. She was practicing as a career counselor at one point in psychology, but N.K. Jemisin swept the Hugo Awards for three straight years, meaning the 5th season, The Obelisk Gate, and The Stone Sky all won it. No one's ever done that before, and for good reason. This is like... This feels very strongly like capital L literature.
Oh, yeah.
This is the kind of thing you could easily do book clubs on and dive into the really deep themes about just like systemic oppression, of course, racism as well. And it is just an incredible epic sort of grimdark fantasy story in itself, but you can tell the whole thing has these parallels to real life in a way that are extremely thoughtfully explored. So it's like it works on both those levels. Like if you were completely oblivious to the real world parallels, you would be like, oh my God, this is incredible fantasy. But with those there, it just takes it up another notch.
So good.
And I'll say, in that first book, N.K. Jemisin pulls a twist that I've never seen before. I won't get into what that is, but something that is extremely interesting and plays with some genre tropes.
And develops her, like delivers her themes home even more. And there's a POV that's all, is it second person narration? Where it's
second
like,
person.
You are this and you are doing that. And it's like, wow, so well written.
Hard to pull off.
And the fact that it blends into the themes of like trying to kind of broaden your empathy and your perspective of the world, and not just in the story, but like I'm talking about the themes of racism and classism and things like that. It just builds so much when you're reading that you are this, you are that, and that's not your background at all, and you're reading it and you're like, wow, this is captivating stuff. So really incredibly well done there. And that brings us to this book that I have not read, but you have, and we've talked about it on the show, so it counts. Book number 84 is
Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is a standalone book that's taking place in a fantasy equivalent of Oxford, where Rebecca Kuang did attend to get, I believe, her master's, and she calls it her love letter and her breakup letter to Oxford. This is another one that gets into a lot of that capital L literature style thematic exploration of actually, in a totally unique way, some relatively similar themes to Jemisin's work that we were just talking about. I think acculturation is really big in this one too. And privilege is another one that's hugely explored, as well as in some ways it's like a takedown of these really huge, academic institutions, especially in England, and some like the imperialistic attitudes as well. It can be dense. It's a huge book. It has footnotes. It's very different from her Poppy War series, but it is incredible, and there's a reason that it was a #1 New York Times bestseller this year.
Mm-hmm.
Charles, shall we move to Jade City?
Let's do it. Book number 85, Jade City, Fonda Lee, first book of the Greenbone saga. This was one that was highly requested from social media for us, and I can see why. It definitely pulls from like Japanese culture, and then it also pulls from like your classic organized crime, especially like the mafia like story elements, and you take those things and you mix them together and you try and tell a story about individual identity in like a strong both family unit and the unit of being a family in organized crime, which is also like another family full of obligations. And it's a really interesting parallel there. Lots of great action in this. I love a good organized crime story, and Fonda Lee hits all the right beats, but successfully tells an engaging story all of her own with that as well. And looking forward to finishing out the Greenbone saga maybe this year, hopefully this year. But we haven't read them yet, so we'll keep moving on. But saying very strong debut for the Greenbone saga, and looking forward to completing it.
World Fantasy Award winner, I believe. So
rightfully well deserved. If you like organized crime, you like kind of this modern Asian setting for a fantasy story, definitely
urban
check it
fantasy.
Out. Yeah, urban, because there's cars and TVs and restaurants.
But far from urban fantasy is an absolute classic of the genre, A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin. Yeah. I mean, it's almost weird to try to review.
For the sake of time, we could power through these.
Where do we even start?
Some of the most incredible, breakthrough, inspiring fantasy ever written, like in terms of twists and plotting and like world building. It's like, oh my God, this is the best. Hard stop. I mean, for some people, it's soured from the show's ending, but that does not take away from how incredible these books are. I think we easily forget, based on just where the Game of Thrones to show ended up, but man, we forget how much this took over the world by storm, like we haven't seen since Harry Potter, which may show up very soon. But yeah, huge fan. I don't see the need to go through these books individually, other than like Game of Thrones was huge, and each book has its moments where you're like shocked and like beyond belief shocked.
Storm of Swords, the third one. Like, I think that's
Game of Thrones and Storm of Swords, I think, are the two standouts. Because Game of Thrones has its own like, and then it's like you think when someone completely shocks you in book one that they're not capable of doing it again because you're expecting it, and even expecting it, you still get shocked. I don't know how he does. He's the only author I've seen that's managed to do that, and to the degree that which he's done it is unparalleled. Also, even compared to like a Sanderlanche, like Martin just, I don't know, he's in a world all of his own. He's complete. Oh my gosh, like I can't even believe it. We need to read these books soon. It's been a decade since I've read them, but that takes us to the next book in the series, not the next book on our list, book number 91. That is The Sword of Kaigan, a Theonite war story by M.L. Wong. This was one that has been recommended to us countless times, especially in the midst of like Make Charles Cry. This was one that was recommended as a tearjerker.
Not everyone knows what that is.
Right, but we talked about it. We talked about it when we talked about Paper Menagerie.
We were trying to make Charles cry.
Yeah.
And we didn't.
Which stemmed from Paper Menagerie. But after that, this one was super highly recommended. I read it while we were on hiatus, and it reminds me a lot of Jade City in terms of like very similar kind of settings, but Sword of Kaigan, the magic system is based more like elemental, like Avatar style, which kind of sells it short to compare it to.
We're talking The Last Airbender. We ain't talking Cameron.
Yeah, it sells it a little short to compare it to that, but for the sake of time, that's what it does. And it's a story about war. It's a story about like family dynamics. The main character is kind of like the matriarch in a traditional like Asian household where they don't really get as much of a voice, and even though she's an accomplished warrior, her opinions are often overshadowed by the man of the house and all that, and then that has implications for the children and the whole community. So these ideas of community and the takes on feminism in here are really strong, and it's just also a tear-jerking story. Another mother-son dynamic in here that's very strong. For whatever reason, that mother-son dynamic is a real tearjerker. So, real big fan of this one. And this one won Spiff. This was a SPIFBO winner, right? So, you can see why. Very well deserved. I think it was... oh shoot! I'm trying to remember what Levi Jacobs said. I think he's like, "There's a reason why it won because no one could stop crying." Something I think was what Levi said about it, which is
it was the year that Levi was the finalist as well. But
moving on,
tough one when you're lining up against the Sword of Kaigan. But that's not the only the Sword of book that you read in that like month
period.
Well, another one was the Sword of Shannara, right, Charles?
Yes, totally different. Whereas the Sword of Kaigan's cutting edge, modern. Sword of Shannara is classic Tolkien clone, old school fantasy, like legitimate. Like yes, even the Wheel of Time, as much as that first book was a Tolkien clone, this one was even worse. But you know, Terry Brooks goes on to write many books in the Sword of Shannara series, and it was made into a TV show. It's classic fantasy. Anyone who wants to brush up on the classics cannot miss Terry Brooks, and you can see why in that book. I'll just move on here to another classic, books number 93 to 99. We're going to send off the first half with Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling. Interesting to talk about them in today's light. There's an interesting conversation to be had about separating the artist from the art, especially around J.K. Rowling's kind of controversial opinions.
But not one we can probably fit into this.
Twitter. No, not even going to attempt to go into it, other than to say
that's its own 200-minute episode.
That I would even be. The books I'm not even equipped to have that conversation. So best led to someone more knowledgeable than me. But I will say that these books are, the most successful fantasy books hard stop, and so we need to get to 200 books, and here we are. I love these books. I'm not not as much as I'm not a fan of J.K. Rowling's opinions about other stuff. I am a big fan of these books as their own stories, and especially those first couple are just like, talk about young adult fantasy, magic school. All of that is done so perfectly in these books, and just the fact that it's managed to be a cultural phenomena for generations and billions of sales and all these other crazy things, and huge film franchises, theme parks, and it brought fantasy to a popular light even before something like like a Game of Thrones, and around the time of the Lord of the Rings movies as well. These were coming out. So incredible stories, and some of the most iconic stories and characters of all time in these books. And I don't need to share my opinion on them. You've all read them. Let's move on to Lev Grossman's Magicians. Talk about taking that like magic school and kicking it up a notch. What was it George Martin said? It was like, take the if Harry Potter is tea, then the Magicians is like some sort of strong alcoholic beverage. I'm butchering the quote, but that's what he says. That's the blurb on the cover of this.
I think he was probably more eloquent than if Harry Potter is tea, then I guess maybe the Magicians is a strong alcoholic beverage of sorts.
Yeah.
But
The Magicians.
yes, it is taking some of those Harry Potter type feel of a book where you have that school setting and that group of friends and all that kind of stuff, and then we make it kind of hanging around that PG-13 R rating. It was fit for TV, apparently, because they did make a TV show that we didn't love. But The Magicians totally
Don't judge it by the TV show.
explores
Forget the TV
these
show.
ideas. Yeah, forget the TV show. The Magicians explores depression and like mental health issues in a way that I think, as someone who's a doctoral student in psychology, it's probably my favorite exploration of that in the fantasy genre. I think that
Quentin is my
Grossman
favorite
covers it.
depressed character ever. He's so well written.
Put that on the blurb.
I have the
And
quote from George, by the way.
this
The
is-
Magicians is to Harry Potter as a shot of Irish whiskey is to a glass of weak tea. Grossman's sensibilities are thoroughly adult. His narrative dark and dangerous and full of twists. Hogwarts was never like this. That's the quote.
Now that is well stated.
That's why he's
So-
writing books and I'm not. So
Yeah.
Love these books.
Anyway, The Magicians, fantastic books. The voice, this is one that Lev Grossman's voice is so strong, and you will see that. The Magicians, The Magician King, The Magician's Land, it's one of that series where those books are kind of inseparable in my head. I just read them back to back to back, but all very strong, and it's cool seeing the characters progress over time because it does follow enough years to really get to see that.
and I do
see a lot of
really badly
changes.
want to read these books on the show. They're some of my favorite fantasy books
We
hard
will.
stop, so they're on the short list to read and discuss on the show. But a
Yeah.
book we
But one
have
we have
discussed. There you go.
Okay, yeah, that's,
A
see,
book
I
with
was doing the
130.
sag, Charles.
Yeah, well, we were both doing
Yes.
the sag. Write Your Revelations,
Yeah.
Michael J. Sullivan, like super popular, like indie smash that's gone on to be traditionally
Originally,
published.
yeah,
Yeah.
originally was self-published. It got picked up, but these were books that were supposed to be fun stories for his family. I believe it was his daughter was struggling with dyslexia, and he wanted to provide her something to read that would be a lot of fun for her and get her into it. And Michael J. Sullivan sits down and he writes the Rhaenyra Revelations, which ended up becoming this smash hit, a book that was basically designed for an audience of one, has
Not unlike
reached
The
an
Hobbit.
audience of many. And sure. And it has 3 books. It's Theft of Swords, Rise of Empire, Heir of Navron, and
Those have multiple
these
books
are-
within them, right? So we could have technically made this
Yeah.
count for 6, but we didn't.
we didn't. And yeah, they were each 2 books and then kind of got put together. And Theft of Swords is a fantastic start. You really get into this like epic fantasy world with different like, dwarves and elves and things like that. But we're taking more modern feeling characters without moving toward this like subversion or grimdark. And it's keeping with this more optimistic tone. I think it's one of those books that just like, it does everything very well. It doesn't stick out in the way that it's like, oh wow, the character writing of Joe Abercrombie or anything like that. It doesn't stick out as like, oh, the fight scenes like John Gwynne, but everything is really done well. And I think that to get into Heir of Navron a little bit, the way that he ties everything together in a satisfying way, it reminded me of Mistborn, actually, and like the way Brandon Sanderson's able to take all these like disparate plot lines and threads and just tie them up in a beautiful bow. And that is what Michael J. Sullivan is able to do with this series.
Well said. And Royce and Adrian, iconic duo.
Yeah.
Some of the most famous in fantasy. Terry Pratchett, let's do these quick. We're way behind the times here. Terry Pratchett, very English, satirical comedy, fantasy novels, Color of Magic. I'll be honest, I wasn't particularly a fan, but I know that's the first book in a series that has captured the imaginations of many, although they'll all say that of all the books in Discworld, although it's the first one, don't start there, which doesn't make any sense to me. Whatever, let's move on. Mort, Dylan, you read this one. I feel similar ideas to what I've said about Color Magic.
Yeah, Mort is it brings in the character of death, and that's a very famous character in Terry Pratchett's work. It does have some of these interesting, like there's certain lines of dialogue that will just come up in my head. There's one where it's like Death will say like because it's the Grim Reaper, basically be like, there's no justice, there's just us. And that is very classic Terry Pratchett, I think. And Mort, I thought, was the strongest that I've read from Pratchett.
The other one we've read, book 108,
Weird Sisters, which is one we read. Which, I don't know, maybe Pratchett's humor is lost on us at times because...
Yes, this one we read at the behest of... Fiction fans. We did this as a collab on their show, and they're like, this is the one you read. And I feel like now I've given Pratchett enough chances where I've just realized, you know what, not for me. I get it. Don't want to take away from Pratchett as a voice in the genre. Certainly cases to be made for putting him on the Mount Rushmore there. A legend. But just ultimately, the writing is not for me. So we'll move on. Black Company, Glenn Cook, military fantasy, the grandfather of grimdark. So if you want to go back and check that out, do that for sure. This is a do not miss in terms of military fantasy and grimdark. So super fascinating kind of breakout series there. Heroes Die. I've talked about this on multiple episodes on the show. Don't sleep on it. Great standalone, although it is part of the Acts of Cain, which went on to be multiple books. Great action in this, and the best exploration of violence as entertainment I've ever read. Bridge of Birds by Barry Hugar.
Well, we should mention the author.
I thought I did, but
Matthew Stover.
Thank you, Matthew Stover. Yeah, check him out. He also wrote a lot of Star Wars novelization, film. A lot of the populars, but it's also a comment on things like 80s action films, was like violence in entertainment. So it's like really interesting. Yes. Bridge of Birds by Barry Hugart. This is part of the Chronicles of Master Lee and Number 10 Ox. Anyone who is really interested in, again, Last Airbender Avatar comes to mind because of the way it's almost...
We're not talking Cameron.
No Na'vi in this. But this, if you're a fan of these, Asian-inspired characters with also a lot of humor, like when I think of Iroh and what's his name? Zuko, thank you. When I think of those two traveling, I get a lot of vibes of the Master Lee and the Number 10 Ox is kind of similar. Like, if you like those parts of Avatar, that relationship, especially early on in the Avatar show, that's here in Bridge of Birds. Highly recommend. And that brings us to a book I have not read, book number 112 today. Dylan, take it away.
A Natural History of Dragons, a memoir by Lady Trent. It's really cool. It's sort of a scientific memoir style approach, obviously fictional memoir because it's about dragons. And it's this story of how this woman, Lady Trent, became kind of an academic who is the world's leading expert on dragons. And you usually see dragons approach as this really mystical thing. So to put on that academic scientific lens is just really interesting and cool. It appealed to the academic in me. And it's just a really well-written, interesting book in itself. So yeah.
This next one I've actually given as gifts to
recommend.
people and recommended, but I've never read, so I'll let you take it.
Sure. Fever Dream by this really unknown author. Who,
Maybe you've heard of him.
Yeah, maybe you've caught word of him. His name's, is it George R. Martin? Oh, George R. Martin is how it's pronounced. A lot of people don't realize that he wrote this book that is basically pitched as vampires on steamboats. A very strange concept, and weird to think that it's written by the guy who wrote A Song of Ice and Fire, but it was, and it's a standalone book. So it's a great story. This one, actually, I think this was one that got me to cry. It is a really emotional one, and what more do you need than vampires on steamboats?
Written by
Come
George
on,
R. R.
and you also
Martin.
get to see George R. R. Martin end something. You get to see him finish a story. So if you want to see that, you can see that in Fever Dream, and he does do a great job. It is a very satisfying conclusion. So
Awesome.
let's move forward to another book that actually has one of the most satisfying conclusions. I love the end to this one, Tigana,
Yeah, I love the
by
premise,
Guy
too.
Gabriel Kay.
We talk
Yeah,
about Guy
Charles, you
Gabriel
wanna get
Kay.
into
One
it?
of the things that always stands out for me is his choice of setting. He always like deep dives into historical research on different areas and uses that to write his books. Tigana was all of his research done in the Mediterranean, especially like Italy. And you see a lot of that influence in this story. I'd be curious to come back and reread this one on the show. It's been a long time since I've read it, but at the time, like in all my research, I was like, I just want a standalone fantasy novel. And everyone said Guy Gavriel Kay is the master. Tigana is one of his best. That and Lions of Our Son, which I've never read. But I picked up Tigana because I heard Italian Mediterranean vibes, and that sold me. And really interesting magic system here. And this idea of a spell of that could make it so that you can't even say the name of a people, like to try and eradicate them that much. And so this theme of like colonialism and like just taking over a society, and like how can you totally wipe a culture off the face of the earth, that with the unique magic system is very interesting. There's some stuff I remember being kind of weird and wild towards the middle and end of this book that I would be curious to reread to see how much I remember is true. But I do remember it being good. And
Yeah, I think
you can wrap it up.
Tigana, I'll just quickly say, love this one, and one of the things that sticks out about it is it was written in 1990. So that's over 30 years ago, and it feels so much more modern than that when you think about what else was coming out during that time. So I think that's also one of the reasons it's such a mainstay is it's well ahead of its time, and you almost forget that when you're reading it. So,
Right, and its choice of setting
Yeah,
is
next
super
up-
interesting. Under Heaven, again, this time
Under
he did a
Heaven.
deep dive on Chinese history. It was around a specific dynasty even that he was doing all this research. And really interesting premise. It's like this guy was given a ceremonial gift from the emperor, and he's just a humble guy, right? Typical protagonist. But he is given an insane number of incredibly valuable war horses. And it's like, okay, now that you've been given that big of a gift, you're almost thrust into the politics of the time, right? It's like you're too valuable to be ignored now, but you also don't have any political standing whatsoever. And just being thrown into that dynamic is super interesting. And you just get to live in Guy Gavriel Kay's world and his writing style. And it's always a pleasant time. And, his books are pretty big, but it's one of those ones you can kind of get lost in. So for that, I would recommend it. There's so many great books with in fantasy now, especially modern ones in Asian settings. And this one, I think, sticks up to all of those. Moving us right along to another face on Mount Rushmore for sure, Robin Hobb, talking about the Farseer trilogy. That's Assassin's Apprentice, Royal Assassin, and Assassin's Quest. These are fantastic books. Talk about also an ending that just sticks with you forever. This one is way up there for me. Like, I remember feeling like so, I don't know if hollow is the right word after reading it, but I was moved. I was impacted, and I was like, oh my God, like, this was serious. Like, this was, what a thoughtful, thought-provoking series. And Dylan, I hope to one day, like, have you read all of these so we can discuss them, because I think there's a lot of interesting parallels to be made to Kingkiller Chronicles.
Yeah, that's what I hear. It was one of the most recommended books when we asked for recs similar to Kingkiller Chronicle, which is so hard to find similar books too. And yeah, I've only read Assassin's Apprentice, the first one so far, and I don't think it grabbed me with the intensity that some people are grabbed by this series. I read it pretty early on in my days of reading fantasy, and I was kind of, I don't know, the way I view fantasy writing has changed a lot since. So curious to see what it'd be like when we, at some point, we're going to read these, right, on the show. So excited for that moment. And another series that I haven't read that I'm excited for when we get to is the Night Angel trilogy by Brent Weeks. And Charles, you're the one who has read this trilogy.
I'd say if you loved Mistborn, like, this is a natural progression. And I think that was my progression, like Mistborn into Night Angel. And there's a lot in terms of, like, it's a hard magic system, and that drives a lot of great action pieces. And with Brent Weeks, though, he's not afraid to get bloody and, like, all the gory details, all the intrigue. He's a little bit edgier than Sanderson is, so definitely lives up to the grimdark title. I know he's gone on to write the Lightbringer series, which is equally, if not more, popular amongst Brent Weeks' work, but I feel like the Night Angel trilogy is the classic, and Brent Weeks is a huge gap in our list of books that we've discussed on the show, so I'm always happy to bring him up when we can, and any fan of grimdark needs to add this to their catalog, especially the Mistborn, like, where there's hard magic that drives like really cool action scenes. That's where this story really shines. So that moves us on to book 122.
When we get there, we're on to 122 is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. You might know it from the HBO series that came out with the same name. And yeah, this book is an interesting blend of sort of dystopian feel. It was written about post-pandemic this was well before COVID. It was interesting timing when I read it, because I read it probably right before COVID, and honestly did completely freak me out, because this is a pandemic that kills like 99.9% of the population. Right. And the book takes place mostly in the aftermath, but kind of tells some stories about the characters beforehand. And it's really her prose and her voice is so strong, and it's got these like slice of life elements and this optimism that you don't often see in that like dystopian genre. So very different book. And by the same author is Sea of Tranquility, which came out very recently in 2022. And it is this one, it actually won the Goodreads Choice Award for 2022 on I was going to say on Goodreads, obviously on Goodreads, for science fiction. And again, Emily St. John Mandel shines with her prose and her voice. There's so many great turns of phrases in this one, and it's really cool. It jumps from like different time periods, beginning as far back as like the early 1900s, and then you're jumping to like a colony on the moon hundreds of years later. So it's pretty cool, and I don't want to get too into it because of potential spoilers, but recommend both of those, especially Station 11, I think, is the stronger of the two. Next up is Brandon Sanderson again with the Reckoners trilogy. Charles, you haven't read this one, so I'll just keep rolling here. I read this during our hiatus. These are so much fun. That's Steelheart, Firefight, and Calamity are the 3 books in the trilogy. It's basically if Brandon Sanderson wrote, oh God, I'm blanking on the, Charles, what's the name of the Amazon Prime series with
The Boys?
the heroes, but they're, The Boys, yeah.
I love The Boys.
So that's So I've not continued with The Boys after like a certain amount of episodes into the second season, but it's basically if Brandon Sanderson wrote The Boys, where all these people, obviously it's far less graphic because it's being written by Brandon Sanderson, who doesn't approach anything like what that show is going to approach, but it does have that larger idea. Yes, no, but the plot is extremely similar, or the premise, I should say, is extremely similar. So if you're like, oh, I love The Boys, but I hate the what most of it,
obscene gore,
extreme violence and gore and just deviant behavior that goes on in it, but I like the premise, then this is definitely for you. It's like a bunch of people end up getting superpowers, but for whatever reason, they're overwhelmingly evil and they're acting like villains, and you get this group of people without powers who are trying to fight against them, and our main character ends up joining that group. I read them back to back to back, so I don't know how well I can break them down individually. I remember them all being pretty similar quality, and I, as always with Sanderson, I really enjoyed the conclusion in Calamity. But yeah, great books. And next up, we've got another series that I read that you have not, Charles. So should I just keep going
as
here?
fast as you can go? We are so behind on the time. We've got technically 15 minutes left.
We're gonna have to change this to under 200 minutes.
Well, I think you posed the question, and the answer is just no. No, we cannot. But let's see how fast we can go
do it in under 2 hours? We cannot. Okay, let's see. Impossible Times trilogy by friend of the show Mark Lawrence. This is if you really love Stranger Things, this is a great recommendation for you. It starts with a character who gets diagnosed with cancer, and he's part of this D&D group. That's why I bring up the Stranger Things. But it's got an interesting balance of it's actually a lot of fun, which doesn't sound like when it's a child gets diagnosed with cancer. But it also it's a lot of fun, has these more existential themes to it as well, and also gets into time travel, and Mark Lawrence gets to flex those scientist skills over there. And yeah, that's One Word Kill, Limited Wish, Dispel Illusion. Awesome conclusion to this one too in Dispel Illusion. And you get to see him kind of get older and advance through time and all of them. So recommend all 3 of those. Next up, Gardens of the Moon, Steven Erikson, Malzahn, Book of the Fallen. Charles, that's one you have read.
I've read Gardens of the Moon, and I've read Deadhouse Gates. I've not read Memories of Ice. To me, it's these are the great example of epic fantasy, especially for those fans that love the big world, big politics, tracking stuff, looking at maps. I think that experience is very rewarding in these. I've just found that that's just not necessarily something that keeps me invested. So I always feel like I have to do homework when I'm reading Malazan. But that's not to belittle
Sell it, Charles.
Maybe one day we'll read it on the show, but it is a lot. And I get that's the appeal of it, so I don't want to take it away for being that. It's just not my cup of tea.
Gardens of the Moon for me was, it gets a lot of flack for being very difficult to follow and get into. It was definitely that way for me at times. Pretty dense, but I felt like I was following it. And then Deadhouse Gates, for whatever reason, I struggled more with that one, which a lot of people really love. And sorry, my beloved French bulldog Mia is breaking into the room that I'm
I
recording.
know. It's like, time's up. It's been almost 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly. That's the buzzer.
Dylan, we got to fly through these, like 30 seconds, man. Let's keep it going.
Dead House Gates was weaker for me. Memories of Ice was the strongest in the series that I read, but I haven't continued beyond that yet. So, next up, another series that honestly is kind of similar in my experience. The highly lauded Jim Butcher's Dresden Files. I read the first two, Stormfront and Full Moon. I hear it gets a lot better, but it just did not really grip me in the way it seems to grip other folks. It is this kind of like pulpy wizard detective guy who lives in Chicago. But
right. I've read Stormfront.
I don't know.
I kind of
Neither one
agree.
really gripped
It was
me.
funny, like it was different. I could see it kicking off a whole pulp genre, but I haven't really delved into it. I liked it. Nick Martell, book number 135, Kingdom of Liars, one of our more recent episodes. Shout out to a fellow Long Islander, a fellow Huntington Long Islander as well. You could see a lot of Brandon Sanderson inspiration here with the storytelling and the plotting and the setting. Very, very strong debut, and can't wait to delve more into it. He just finished this trilogy, The Legend of the Mercenary King, so highly recommend fans of Sanderson check this one out, and you will not be upset. Now, Dylan, there's a lot of these coming up that only you have read, so I'll ask you to blaze through these as best as you can.
Okay, and my lovely assistant Mia is helping me now. So
fantastic. With the power of Mia. Take it away with book number 136.
Okay, that's City of Lies, Sam Hawke, First of the Poison Wars. This is like an Australian saying, and it's a character who's like being trained as a poisoner. It covers some folks with like mental health disorders in a way that people really appreciate, and I think that was done tastefully and well. But the book, just for whatever reason, didn't grip me that much, and it's pretty much what I have to say about that, I guess. But it's well written, I think. It just maybe wasn't for me. Next up, The Gutter Prayer, Gareth Ryder Hanrahan, First of the Black Iron Legacy. This one I did really enjoy. It all takes place kind of in one city, and the city is really like belovedly written. I think that it's another one that is a return to form, as you said earlier, for monsters. Really cool, awesome monsters in this one. I do recommend that book. Okay, R.R. Verdi's The First Binding, First in the Tales of Tremaine. That one, it's so much like the Kingkiller Chronicle to the point where some people have been alarmed or disconcerted by it. But if you're waiting on the Kingkiller Chronicle's third book, then
there's Tolkien clones. Why can't there be Rothfuss clones?
This is kind of a Rothfuss clone, and it can help fill that Kingkiller size shape in your heart. And next up, First 15 Lives of Harry August by Claire North. This is a really cool time travel story, unique in a lot of ways. One of my favorite reads that we went to over our hiatus, or that I read over hiatus. And it's a character that basically every time they die, they like start over in their life with the same knowledge that they'd already accumulated, and they play it over again. Next up, you haven't read this either, right, Charles? Elantris, Brandon Sanderson. This is his first published novel. Sorry, Mia is noisy. I don't know if you can hear that.
No, you're good.
No, you can't? Really?
Well, maybe when on your native audio you can, but Zoom is filtering it out.
Okay, I'm going to try to get her out of here,
Elantris,
probably.
Sanderson,
Elantris.
Next.
She is like freaking out, Charles. You have no idea. She does this. I'm gonna get her out of here.
All right, so The Gilded Ones by Namina Forna. I've never read this, but the title sounds interesting. The Chosen and the Beautiful.
Okay, Mia's been removed. So
I attempted to rate a book I haven't read. I just said it sounded good.
I'm sure that went well. Elantris, this is Brandon Sanderson's first book. It's still very good, but I think his weakest among all his published
Your
novels
first
that I've
book,
read.
you know.
Of course. Namina Forna's The Gilded Ones, fantastic YA book that it's about actually a character who, I'll just say it goes in a totally different direction than I was expecting. Okay, Charles. I'm getting the speed it up from Charles
let's
here.
go. Let's go. We're behind.
We'll keep going. It's a good book. Nevos, The Chosen and the Beautiful. This is a Gatsby retelling of, actually from Jordan's perspective. That is Nick's love interest in The Great Gatsby. It's really well done. It's got magic obviously involved with like deals with devils and this like paper magic as well. And the character is, really cool. Prose is very Fitzgerald-y, so amazing job there. Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. That is a really, really poignant story. It's another one I can't get into too much because of like anything really revealed about the plot is kind of a spoiler, but there's also a movie on that one that I didn't like as well as the book. Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. That's this like sci-fi, it's got really like 3 novellas that come to form a full story, and it follows this like relatively young girl with powers, but it is another one that takes a very different turn to anything you could have expected. She's kind of being like recruited for a school like on another planet, and she comes from a very different culture than the dominant one. Okay, Heir to the Empire, Timothy Zahn, Star Wars: The Thrawn trilogy. This one's like one of the top, the top rated Star Wars novels. I don't know if you've read this, Charles.
I have not, but the Thrawn trilogy is very popular. I do know that. I don't think I've read any Star Wars novelizations.
Wow. Didn't really work that well for me. Maybe I'm just not a Star Wars novelization guy, but it does pick up after the original trilogy and tries to keep telling that story with this like Thrawn as the main villain in it. I don't know, just didn't really do it for me. Same with Homeland by R.A. Salvatore, the Forgotten Realms Dark Elf trilogy. This is like Drizzt. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but if you ever see that name, that series, it follows this dark elf. It's very Dungeons and Dragons because it's brought to you by Forgotten Realms. And it's like, dark elves are bad, but this guy, maybe he's not bad. And what happens then? But it's, I don't know. I hear that trilogy. It's a really long series that's been done for many years. I hear it's great. The first one maybe wasn't exactly my cup of tea. I think we're like entering the books that I don't think about as much and was like scraping.
Well, we can go by them quickly then. Let's be quick.
I'm doing good.
You're doing great, but we could also be fast.
Okay. Will White's Traveler's Gate series, first one, House of Blades, is it's pretty good. It is a series where kind of the character is not the chosen one. Their friend ends up being the chosen one, and the character's like, oh, I guess I gotta earn my place in history and all that. But it's sci-fi. It's not like fantasy-ish, and it's got portals and stuff. Cradle is also Will White. It's first 2 books I read, Unsouled, Soulsmith. People describe this, it's like really addictive, and it's progression fantasy, like the character keeps getting stronger and stronger like in a video game. Neither of the first 2 books were really getting me into it. I hear it gets even better later on, and then you're really rolling, but they're relatively short and action-packed, so recommend if you're looking for that. Raven's Mark trilogy. That is Ed McDonald. I always recommend this as underrated grimdark for fans of Joe Abercrombie. Because they have that sense of dry humor in addition to being pretty grimdark. Great morally gray protagonist. That's Blackwing, Ravencry, and Crowfall. All right, Alana, The First Adventure by Tamora Pierce. That is the first in the Song of the Lioness. This is like Tamora Pierce is kind of like a classic author. in the fantasy genre, wrote all these like YA books. It's one of the first books to really have like a strong female protagonist, like in more modern-ish fantasy. And I actually really enjoyed it, even though it probably was written for folks a little younger than me. Becky Chambers' The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet is up next. Incredible space opera, really optimistic. It's like a hug in the form of a space opera about a crew that is like all from different backgrounds and has to come together and kind of be a found family as they complete this like trip across the stars. So next up, Naomi Novik, Spinning Silver. Honestly, this is one. Not my favorite.
Okay.
I gotta give a review.
I said I'm curious about this one, and I didn't know what you were going to go.
Oh, you're curious. I thought you said who cares about this one.
I said I'm curious because I've read Uprooted, and I had similar feelings to yours on Spinning Silver.
This is like a Rumpelstiltskin retelling. I read it because I was doing Our Fantasies like bingo board for, and one thing was like a retelling. I was like, okay, Naomi Novik. I hear amazing things about her work. I don't know. This one was so hard for me to get through for whatever reason. I was pretty bored, but I had to finish because I wanted to cross off that bingo board thing. So, I think I gave this 2 stars on Goodreads. Sorry, Naomi Novik, if you're out there.
I mean, she's doing quite okay because Uprooted won the Hugo Award, right? I don't know what Spinning Silver, if that won anything, but I think Uprooted is a Hugo Award winner, and that's why I read it. And I remember being like... kind of underwhelmed by it. It's like there's a dragon, but he's a guy in a tower, and there's this relationship that to me, like whatever. I will say there's a very interesting idea about how like this scary part of relationships where you are, turn to phrase planning roots, but this idea of like how it can be scary to open your life up to someone else and how that can kind of keep you like limit your options in life, but also why that's a good thing. So that was interesting, but the story itself wasn't for me.
Okay. Next up, Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This is a really phenomenal sci-fi story brought to you by the man who wrote The Martian, which you'll get into, Charles. And it is extremely strong book that is, I think, best enjoyed in the form of an audio book, but it's a protagonist. It's kind of like The Martian in the way that he's got some of this knowledge. He was a teacher and he's trying to apply it in this setting where he just like finds himself on a spaceship with like his whole crew around him already like dead. So love that book. Best enjoyed, I think, in audio. Next up, Charles, it's The Martian.
I loved The Martian. It's so funny. It's told in these journals. The way he balances like science and like growing potatoes and like trying to survive on Mars with the humor is exceptional. It's a story of a guy who gets left behind on Mars and very limited resources and is trying to figure out how to stay alive. Super fascinating. Went on to be a blockbuster movie. So any fan of science fiction that hasn't checked this out is missing out on a fantastic story. I'll say that.
Okay, but you don't want to miss out on Rebecca Roanhorse's Black Sun. That's a really strong book. It is one that I read during our hiatus. I would say great recommendation for fans of the Broken Earth trilogy. That's my super quick review for that one. Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club. You've probably heard of the movie. It was based on a book. I actually think the movie is even stronger, but the book is still 5-star read from me. And if you're like, oh, I know Fight Club, but I want to read something else by that author, you can check out Survivor, which I also threw 5 stars on Goodreads, I believe. And it's like Fight Club in a lot of ways. He's kind of a one-trick pony, Palahniuk, but I love the one trick he does, and he does it again in Survivor. Different premise with like the last survivor of a cult, actually. But okay, next up, Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom by, I think it's Lee Bardugo is how it's supposed to be pronounced, the Six of Crows duology. This is fun heist fantasies, and there's a show that incorporates these that's out now. You can find on Netflix. Six of Crows, it's, I think, stronger than the second installment, but they're both definitely worth a read. Next up, we've got Abercrombie. Again, this is his YA trilogy.
I haven't read
It is the Shattered Sea trilogy. Yeah, half a king, half the world, half a war. These are it's really interesting to see Abercrombie write YA because he's keeping his voice, but he's losing some of the more like gruesome stuff and trying, not to curse. So it's great. It's not as strong as the First Law stuff at all, but they are great books. And if you're a fan of Abercrombie, looking for more, and you've read all the First Law universe, I highly recommend.
Or if you want to get your preteen into Joe Abercrombie without introducing him to more mature themes.
Yeah. Fair. So, Half a War is a really cool ending that I've never seen anything like it before. So, I'll say that too. Okay, next it's the Mistborn Era 2 books, The Alloy of Law, Shadows of Self, The Bands of Mourning, The Lost Metal. I don't know if I can review them each too well individually because they all blend into one. But
so do it in one.
Yeah, they're kind of more pulpy than the original Mistborn trilogy. You're advancing in time where it's like now you've got guns and some of these more Western aspects to it. As the series moves along, it gets more like it gets a broader scope, and it actually gets more imperative that you have previous knowledge of Sanderson's Cosmere to fully appreciate it, especially The Lost Metal, which is the one that just came out this last year. Okay, Skyward series, also Brandon Sanderson. I really love all these books. They're sci-fi, still bringing in this great, I guess it's not, I'll still call it a magic system, by Sanderson. It starts with the book Skyward, that is one of my favorite protagonists in all of Brandon Sanderson's work.
Is this the one that you like? So. Also really like the prologue? Is that?
This has a great prologue. I almost forgot about that. Great prologue, but it continues all the way through Starsight. Then there's these novellas that take different perspectives, but are still extremely interesting. I considered those just kind of as one book here, and they're also Jancy Peterson co-writes those with Sanderson. And the most recent one's Cytonic. And the world just keeps expanding, or the universe just keeps expanding these books, and the stories get more broad, and they each take kind of a different approach. The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland. That's Catherine M. Valenti. This is middle grade, I believe is what they call it. So it's for kids. Mm-hmm. And I read this also for our fantasy, which was read a middle grade novel. It's really charming and whimsical, and I do recommend this for a parent trying to read it with their kiddo. Okay, next up, Acacia trilogy. Acacia, The Other Lands, The Sacred Band. These are they're kind of what I was describing for R.R. Verdi's first binding is to the Kingkiller Chronicle. This series is to actually Game of Thrones, I would say. It's got such clear parallels to characters in Song of Ice and Fire. It follows this family where the kids kind of get separated and they all go their own path, kind of like the Stark children. But it's got definitely different elements, but you can just see the Game of Thrones influence so clearly. Not nearly as strong as Game of Thrones, but underrated, I would say. Next up is a book that probably you can't call underrated. It's Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. It's a classic. It's a classic of sci-fi. A great book club book, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, interesting one to include, but okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a classic for sure. I've never read it, but
it fits. You never read it? It fits. Next up, Phantom Tollbooth, Norden Juster. I hope I'm saying that right. That is a book that I read as a little kid. I'm reading it in my profile picture on Twitter. It's me, a little kid in sunglasses. It helped spark my love for fantasy as a child. And if you've got a kiddo, then maybe it can help you do the same for them. Next up is M.R. Carey's The Girl with All the Gifts. This is another one I can't get into much without spoiling stuff, so I'll just say it's got dystopian elements. It's relatively short. It's got a great audiobook.
It was made into a movie too, right?
Next up, Charles. It was. Red Rising, Charles. You read
Red
that.
Rising. Yeah, this one, like, obviously it's a super popular series now, but to me it kind of rode the wave of like the Hunger Games fame, where it's a similar young adult sci-fi series of tournaments, classism, dystopian future kind of thing. But what makes Red Rising a bit kind of next level for me is the exploration of, like, again, identity, and like the amount in which the main character sacrifices to go through that fight, I think is a bit more than Katniss did, and it's way more sci-fi and way more space travel-y, which is another kind of benefit. Yeah, it's just a lot of fun, great action piece. Anyone who liked Hunger Games would definitely have to check this out, and dare I say it is better than Hunger Games, so check out Red Rising.
He dared to say it.
Dare I say it.
And next up is The Raven Cycle by Maggie Stiefvater. Raven Boys, The Dream Thieves, Blue Lily, Lily Blue. It's hard to say title. Fast. The Raven King. Yeah, it is. So it's a YA series. I think it was very strong. She's one of those authors that I go right to, like, oh, she has a really great voice. It's kind of like something's going to compare it to like the Hardy Boys, even though I've never read that, but it's like it's a group of teens that are trying to... Interesting, you never read
the Hardy Boys.
Yeah, so it's a group of teens that are trying to deal with some of this like mythical stuff, and there's some mystery elements to it, and also some romance. I think it's all the books are strong. And next up is Anthony Ryan's Blood Song. This is first published novel. I believe this one started as self-published as well. And it's got that kind of frame story feel similar to like the Kingkiller Chronicle, if you're familiar, where it's this legendary figure telling their story. And it's really, really good. I think it's a lot stronger than the later books in the series, so I would this one might work well as a standalone. But anyway, the character's on his way to what they consider to be basically an execution, and he's telling his story to a chronicler. Really good. Next up, this is the most recent book I've read, Lost in Time by A.G. Riddle. It is a time travel story about a father who, like, they live in this world near future where this like time machine thing has been invented, and the way they deal with like bad criminals, instead of the death penalties, they just send them back to prehistoric times. And this guy is falsely convicted of a really bad crime, and he's one of the inventors of the time machine thing, and then they use it to send him back to like the Triassic period. And it's I love this book. It moves really quickly. It's also got like a parallel storyline. Yeah, it's great.
Seems kind of reckless to just send criminals into the past.
I know. Yeah, it is relatively reckless, but they do it. And
I guess you send them back really far enough where they can't mess with history, but you never know, butterfly effect situation.
The idea is it creates like a parallel timeline, so they can't actually do anything to impact the...
I see. That's how
but
they get
is all the science worked out? Who's to say? Who's to say?
Who's to say?
And who is to say? Not I. But I will say that this is a fantastic new book. It was nominated for Goodreads choice, but lost to Sea of Tranquility for science fiction. And anyway, parallel storyline of his daughter working in like the present day to try to like get him back and save him. So next up, Brian McClellan, fellow podcaster, with he's also like primarily known for being an author, and the Powder Mage trilogy is the one that most people know him for. That's Promise of Blood, The Crimson Campaign, and The Autumn Republic. Really cool magic system. You can tell he's one of Brandon Sanderson's former students, and you can really tell that influence in the way he writes this magic system. There's these elements of almost like new school magic, which is more like being able to use more of a hard magic system, like twist bullets to follow the direction you want them to, and you like have to snort this drug to make it happen, versus some of this more mystical old school magic where you don't really know how it works. Like these two opposing sides play out there. It's a great series. It's action packed. I think Promise of Blood, the first one, is the strongest. I did think it lost a little bit of steam as it went on, but still strong books. Next up, Brian Staveley's Chronicles of the Unhewn Throne, Book 1, The Emperor's Blades. This is a good book. I like it. It's about three children of a, like, I think now dead monarch who kind of have to find their own way, taking a few different paths, and it's an entertaining read. Next up, Dan Wells, I'm Not a Serial Killer. This is an interesting one. It actually got made into a movie, and it's by Brandon Sanderson's friend, Dan Wells. They do Writing Excuses together. He is writing a book about a character that has like these early tendencies, like a teenage character, early tendencies that might mark like he might become a serial killer in the future. And he is obsessed with serial killers. And then there is like these killings going on in his hometown, and he starts investigating, but there's obviously these like fantasy elements to it that I won't go into detail because probably spoiler. Next up, you've read this one and I have not, Charles.
Yeah, American Gods by Neil Gaiman. This is an interesting one. It reads, Neil Gaiman is kind of classic for writing almost these like spooky, atmospheric kind of stories when you think of Sandman or Coraline or some of the other series that he's written. But American Gods is right along that vein. Great book. Almost, did I say already? It was almost like fever dreamy in the way he kind of writes some of the stories. It's ideas that there's new gods. It's kind of funny because there's the old gods that you're familiar with, but then these new ones that humanity's created, like gods of technology, this idea that we've worshipped the television by watching it so much that we've created a god. And like those kinds of things are super interesting in these books. If you like Neil Gaiman, it's a lot of fun, and they made a show out of it on Showtime that I've not seen, but really well written. If you like that kind of moody, atmospheric world that Neil Gaiman is famous for creating, it's a worthy read for that alone. And it's American Gods.
Charles, we might be able to do 200 books in 2 hours and 22 minutes if we time it just right. I don't know.
I've got us at 2:14 in terms of like I started the timer when we talked about the first book, so
okay,
we can keep this working.
This might work. This might work. Just get us to 2 hours and 22 minutes.
I can't tell how much of this was us talking before we hit record, though. That's the thing. I have no idea.
I thought. Oh yeah. Well, I thought you said it was 2 hours and 14 since
the first book. Yeah.
Let's pretend it's good. Let's get to that 2 hours and 22 minutes. We're gonna nail it. So let's see. We're up to Autonomous by Annalee Newitz. This is I think relatively near future story that is. It's got elements of like those kind of things you're used to toying with since Blade Runner or Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, of like how human can AI be and all that kind of stuff. It's a really strong read and really not like anything else that I can think of in terms of how it goes about exploring those themes, but we'll get into detail on that. A.J. Austin's The Inner Lands, Something Stirs. This one I read for when I was judging for SPIFBO, and this was a cool one. I advanced it to the next round. It's got a lot of psychological elements. It has this idea of this impending threat coming their way, kind of that reminded me of like White Walkers in A Song of Ice and Fire, but it's a pretty intimate, personal story about two characters primarily. Do recommend that one, looking for a great self-published book. Next up, Brandon Sanderson's Legion, The Many Lives of Stephen Leeds. This is one that not a lot of people talk about, but it's a cool premise. It's a character who basically like perceives there to be all these, they're kind of like hallucinations, but not really in the way that like we'd think about them in psychology. But bear with me, these hallucinations of people around him who like talk to him and interact with him, but they all hold this like great knowledge, each of them. And obviously no one else sees these people. So when they communicate that knowledge to Stephen Leeds, he then like can present it to other people around him. So they think of him as like this super genius, and he's like solving crimes and stuff. But, from the reader's perspective, you're like, oh, he's mostly just like taking the stuff from these people around him. Just no one can see it. Okay, next up is a book that it's another time travel story. It actually helped inspire Groundhog Day, the movie, like the Bill Murray vehicle.
Oh,
and
of course.
Ken Grimwood, and it's actually got a similar premise to what I said earlier for Harry August, except it came well before Harry August, and it is a character that like dies of a heart attack and then just like wakes up in their own college like body with all the memory from before, and just keeps happening over and over again. And playing with that idea. And last up, Charles, I'll let you take it.
Book number 200.
Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. Book number 200.
How many times have we talked about
graphic
this?
novel series.
One of these
Saga.
days we're getting around to reading it on the show. But yeah, Saga. Right now, the 10th volume is the most recent. And wow, one of the best works of fiction hard stop in my eyes. And I've said that countless times on the show, yet we have never read it. One day I would love to read it. One day I would love to talk to Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. It's just like such a great modern space opera story with fantasy like intimately woven within it. Just a great story. Incredible characters. I don't know how you would adapt this to the screen, but gosh, we need to see it. It's I don't know what else to say. Space opera with fantasy-esque characters and worlds, but at the center of it all, it's a story about family, and that's what really makes it really makes it sing. And there you go, guys. That was 200 books in 2 hours and 22 minutes. So I think...
Was it?
Well, 2 hours and 19 minutes and change. So we got to the end only a little bit over time.
Should we talk about Abercrombie for 3 more minutes?
I don't think anyone wants to. I think we could just play that sweet, sweet outro music for a couple minutes and thank the people and get on out of here.
All right. Let's play that sweet, sweet outro music then, Charles.
All right, getting it pumping now. Thank you all so much. 200 books, guys. We did it. Who else but the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast would review 200 books straight on their 200th episode? And you know what? We do it entirely for the love of the game. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like what you heard today and you want to support the show even more, you can do that by chatting with us over on social media. Let us know if any of these books kind of stuck out to you in our descriptions. If there's any you'd want to add to the list, you can do that on Instagram at the FTF Podcast and on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 on the end. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today, they loved hearing about over 200 books being discussed today, and they want to support the show even more than following us on social media and listening, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, and you can now do that over on Spotify. That's where 60% of you are listening based on what I was looking at. Wow. Yeah, it's amazing. And that's just 2 clicks, 1 click for each 100 episodes that we've done, and you can provide us with that 5-star rating over at the top of our Friends Talking Fantasy feed, and you can give us 5 stars that way. We appreciate it so much. You can also throw us a review on Apple Podcasts if you'd like, ratings, they're great. But you know that we do this for the love of the game, so just listening is more than enough. Thank you for doing that. Some of you probably 200 times. I'm sure you're out there, so...
My mom?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, Charles's mom. So,
yeah, Dylan,
thank you, Charles's mom.
You said it exactly correct. Just listening is already more than enough. 200 episodes in. Can't even believe we've got this far. And I'm looking forward to more. There's only the beginning of the new year, and we have so many exciting things coming up. And we do it just for the love of the game, and you guys listening is more than we could have ever hoped for. So thank you all so much for listening. And again, as always, for the 200th time, go forth and conquer.